Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Moore, and I am here to talk to you today about scale up sustainability. And so this is a topic I'm actually really excited about. I love talking about sustainability, and I think it's not discussed as much as it could be and should be in the work that we do. So, I am from the Center for Implementation. We are a very small social enterprise that trains, supports, and empowers people like you who are using the science of implementation to actually implement and scale things. And so, in the world, people kind of know us this way as people who are trying to synthesize and translate all of this implementation science knowledge that we've been gaining and trying to make it really practical for people who are on the ground trying to actually implement and scale things. So that is hopefully what I'm going to do today as we talk through what it looks like to think about sustainability planning when you are at the scale up phase. So the first thing we really like to start with when talking about sustainability planning is starting by talking about having a collective vision. And that's because we often find that when we're doing implementation, it is very easy to have a bit of a head down mindset. What are we working on? What do we need to do next? Where are we going from here? Getting really into those nuanced details. But as we start thinking about scale up and sustainability, it becomes just so important to kind of take a step back and look up. Where is it that we want to go? And so we love using analogies. And one of the analogies we like to use is the analogy of a lighthouse. Sometimes it is very hard to even see or envision where it is that sustainability and even scale up might go. And I think that what happens is people then don't have a clear idea of what that looks like. And they definitely don't have a collective vision of what it would mean to effectively sustain something at scale. But when we are all on the same page about the destination we're going, it is so much easier to get people on board and to ultimately get to that destination. So it's really helpful to start by having conversations around where is it that we would love to go? What is this light that we are all working towards? I will admit this is actually a very challenging part of the task. And so we have a couple of kind of unconventional tips that we have found really useful in the process of creating a collective vision for sustainability. One of the first things I love doing is starting with the ideal and then working backwards. So if I asked you the question, what would this vision or what would this look like if you had unlimited resources, total buy-in from absolutely everyone involved? What would your vision for sustainability be? Have a conversation, multiple conversations around what that would really look like. And then from there, scale back and say, okay, well, we don't have unlimited resources. So what could we achieve that would get us close to that vision that we would do if we had unlimited resources? Another way to think about this is to play what we call the what if game. What if this was a top priority for the government? Imagine a government, maybe a national government or a local government, shows up and says, we love what you are doing. We are prepared to invest in doing this at the policy level, at a funding level. What would sustainability look like at that point? So start brainstorming that. And again, you might not have that level of commitment from the government, but you can scale back and have at least a dream of what it would look like if you could get there. When coming up with this collective vision, get people involved. Think about people that you might not conventionally engage in the work because sometimes they have amazing ideas, incredible connections, and they can really take this to the next level. Finally, this is actually my favorite tip, is when talking about sustainability, you're going to have to talk about this to a lot of different people who do not understand the nuances of the work that you are doing. So practice by describing what you would say if you were talking to like an aunt or a neighbor or a friend who does not work in your field, what would you say to them about the vision you have for sustainability? Describing things in plain language like this is super, super helpful. Once you have a really clear vision of what you would love for sustainability to look like in the future, then it's really helpful to think about who is actually going to support this vision for sustainability. Who is going to support the work to get us to this place? What is amazing about this is at this point, you've actually talked about a lot of these concepts in previous lectures. So there's lectures about who to involve and who to engage in the process. And all the things you learned there are still applicable here. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of different visuals and frameworks that we find really helpful in thinking about who to involve when planning for sustainability. And the key to thinking about who to involve is recognizing that all implementation work and all sustainability work is relational. We need to have social connections and relationships to do all implementation work. This is true for implementation, but it is especially critical for sustainability when often different people become responsible for different parts of the process. And so essentially, different people have to share costs, resources, responsibilities, and build on the momentum. And as those shift, understanding all those people and their roles and how they work together just becomes really vital to the process. So the first framework that we find really helpful in thinking about who is involved is called the Interactive Systems Framework. This was created by Wondersman and colleagues quite a few years ago, back in 2008, and there was actually just a brand new version that was just released, kind of ISF 2.0, that was launched, and so you can take a look at that as well. What we really like about this is it's one of the only frameworks we know about in implementation science that describes the roles that people play in the system. I'm going to quickly go over this here, but there are lots of resources out there if you want to dig deeper into understanding this framework. So I like to start in the heart of change here. That's understanding that the reason we're doing all this work is ultimately that someone benefits. Maybe this is people in the community. Maybe this is patients that you have, right? Often it's patients. Maybe it is their caregivers. And in order for these people to benefit, there are people who need to change their behavior to do something differently so that these people benefit. The people being asked to change their behavior are what we call the recipients. These are often professionals in the system. So obviously they might be like nurses and doctors, community health workers, right, who are being asked to do something differently to ultimately benefit the beneficiaries. In order to support these people to change, ideally, we have what we would call a behavior change system or a local implementation team that might help the recipients implement a new program, follow new guidelines. But in order for this local implementation team to know what to do in order to effectively support the recipients, they are ideally supported by a support system, which might be a central implementation team. So say you have multiple sites, ideally every site has a local implementation team, plus there's a central team that is supporting all of those different sites. We often also have a synthesis and translation system, which is people who are taking the literature, synthesizing it, translating it, and making it practical and applicable for people at all levels. And what we really love about this framework is it highlights that there are all these additional roles in the system, but that they might live in different places depending on the situation. So researchers can live in all of these different boxes. Sometimes you might have people who have a broker role. Sometimes funders are embedded, say, inside of the support system. We often have people who are convening different pieces of work. We have decision makers who are sometimes more on the outside and sometimes they're embedded inside. And occasionally we have what we call a secondary implementation support team. Sometimes we have multiple layers, especially say if you have an initiative across multiple countries. What we see all the time is that people can map out their roles in the system during the implementation phase, and that can be awesome. But when we transition to thinking about sustainability, the roles in the system actually change. Who is playing what role and what they need to do is often different as we transition to sustainability. This is particularly true of groups like researchers, who often play more of a backseat role during sustainability compared to initial implementation. And so understanding what roles in the system are there and how they might change as you transition in sustainability is so helpful. Another way to think about the different aspects of relationships during sustainability is using what we call the relational pathway. And so this is a very simple pathway that we use for all of implementation that helps us think about the different ways in which we connect with and relate to other people. For example, we have a lot of work in sustainability around convening, bringing people together to plan for sustainability work. We also need to figure out what partnering looks like. So thinking about that last slide where I talked about all of the different roles people play, partnering involves determining what level of involvement and kinds of roles and relationships people are going to have. So maybe you're going to have, for example, local governments that play a much larger role in sustainability phases than initial phases. So what will that look like? It is also really helpful to have some governance structures. So sometimes we need really formal things, and sometimes they can be a little less formal, but this is about understanding how are decisions made, what roles are people playing, what is the process of making changes, for example. And then we want to think about how can we work together as a team to actually operationalize this sustainability plan, and how can we work across the system? Because when you're scaling, that means you're working across the system. And so we need to think not just locally, but across that whole system. Finally, we really believe in embedding equity into all of the implementation work that we do. And so we have created something we call the equity iceberg and equity guiding questions. And so what we did is we tried to figure out what are the different questions that you and your team can ask yourselves at every single phase of implementation. So I'm going to, hopefully this works. I'm going to try to click on the link and show you what it looks like. So here's a link to the website, and anyone can go and access this tool. And you scroll down until this image pops up. And it shows different aspects of implementation, like the actions that we take, the relationships we have, the systems and structures in which we work, and the mental models that are underneath all of those things. Here we're talking about relationships, so I'll use that as the example. So if you follow here, there's the relational pathway. You click on that. And then it takes you to a place where you can click on any of these buttons, and it asks you some questions that you can discuss with your team to make sure that the work is being done in an equitable way. So I'll give you one example of working across a system. Since you're thinking about scale and sustainability, this one seems like a good fit. And so it says, who is at the table, who is not at the table, and why? Have you considered implementing with and not intervening on particular populations? And do communication and collaboration strategies help you meet people where they're at? So 3 small questions that are actually a lot of work to delve into. So that can be really helpful to bring to your team if you want to have sustainability discussions. Finally, we can actually get to describing what it is that you are sustaining. So interestingly, it's surprising to a lot of people that I put this at the end when I talk about sustainability, but I think you kind of have to set the stage really well to get to this place. So I'm going to start with a quick story about where my love for sustainability came from. I was a grad student and I was working supporting some local implementation teams, and they were at the sustainability phase. They had 4 years of grant funding. They had finished the funding, were almost finished, and they were sustainability planning. And people from the organization I was at as a grad student got invited to the sustainability planning meeting, and they asked if I would join. I was so pumped. So I went to the meeting and I sat down, And it was the most tense meeting I had ever attended at that point in my career. I was blown away by the tension, the confusion, the animosity in the room. And so what I ended up learning and doing and figuring out is people were not talking about the same thing. I couldn't figure out what they were talking about, but I could tell that they were not really talking about the same thing together. And it kind of got me really interested in sustainability and why this happens. And I think the biggest first reason this happens is sustainability has so many components that it is very easy for people to be talking about different aspects of sustainability. Sometimes people are talking about, oh, are we sustaining what we would call the what, the thing that you are implementing, the program, the practice, the guideline. So are people still delivering this guideline? Sometimes people are talking about sustaining what we would call the how, or those implementation strategies. Are people still using champions? Do people still have audit and feedback in place? Are people still delivering training? Sometimes people are talking about, have we sustained the outcomes we achieved during the implementation phase? Plus, many people recognize that as they transition to sustainability, it is often inevitable that there will be some adaptations to the initial program practice guideline. There are always some adaptations to the implementation strategies we use. For example, say you had training initially. Are you going to have booster training? How are you going to train new staff? What is that going to look like? Do you have champions? Are the champions going to stay the same people indefinitely? Not a good idea. So we need to make adaptations to who champions are, what they're doing, how they're supporting implementation during that sustainability phase. And we often had rigorous measurement during initial implementation and no longer have the funding for that. So how are we going to know we're still achieving outcomes if we're not able to measure in the same way and have made adaptations to those measurements? Some people are also thinking about the fact that there are so many factors that affect sustainability. Funding, everyone goes to funding, but also things like context, capacity, right? Like all the different things in the system that are affecting our ability to actually go and implement things. And I'm going to give you one little tip. Everyone wants to talk about funding, and funding can be very important to sustainability. But there is research that shows that funding alone is not enough to sustain. It does not matter if you have only funding. We need to think about all of these other pieces that need to be in play. And we have actually seen a surprising number of initiatives sustain successfully without funding or with very limited funding, leveraging those relationships. I'm now going to tell you my favorite piece of news about sustainability. There is research that shows that if you plan for sustainability, it increases the likelihood you will actually sustain. So this sounds obvious and kind of like the type of thing you'd be like, duh, of course that's true. But I'm going to repeat it because it is so powerful. The act of planning for sustainability increases the chances you will actually sustain. That means literally bringing people together to plan for sustainability can increase the chance that will actually happen. When we sit down to do sustainability planning, we love to draw on existing sustainability planning tools. There are 3 of them that are highly used in implementation science that we really like. We've used all 3 multiple times. They kind of work best in different contexts, so I'll share all 3 of them and give you kind of one short illustration before we wrap this up. The first one is called the Program Sustainability Assessment Tool. This one has a website which we'll link to with lots of online resources, a tool, guiding questions, lots of guidance. And it really works best for community-based implementation efforts. So if you're doing community-based work, this is a great place to start. If you're working in a healthcare setting, implementing like a guideline in a healthcare setting, like a hospital, you're implementing a guideline, the NHS sustainability model is a great place to go. Again, there's some tools online, resources. People have used it in hundreds, maybe thousands of hospitals. And so this is a great one. The long-term success tool is kind of a balance between these two different pieces, the program sustainability assessment tool and NHS sustainability model. So it kind of balances those two out. And so it's a great one to check out as well, especially if you maybe have both aspects in the work that you are doing. And so I just want to give you a quick preview of the program sustainability assessment tool to highlight the kinds of things it shares. It shows you the different factors that affect sustainability, so those things around, things that we already know about, but helps us systematically think through them. Things like funding stability, partnerships, organizational capacity, program evaluation, adaptations, communication, environmental support, and building a strategic plan. So you can go and check out these tools and see how they can help you systematically think through all of these different components. So as our wrap up and key messages, it is great to start your sustainability planning journey by beginning with creating a collective vision of sustainability and scale. What is the destination you want to get to? Number two, map and consider the roles in the system and how these are going to change as you get into sustainability and scale. Three, remember that one thing that's really challenging about discussing sustainability is that there's so many components. I love bringing that visual of all the components when people are talking. And if people start kind of going all over the place, being like, oh, it sounds like we're talking about outcomes here. It sounds like we're talking about factors here. And it kind of grounds the conversation in a really nice way. Finally, it is great to know that sustainability planning increases the likelihood you will actually sustain. And so use sustainability planning tools to help you with this process. We have a bunch of different resources that can help you grouped into these different categories, things like the interactive systems framework, that relational pathway, and the equity guiding questions. Plus, we have links for the sustainability components, and then those three tools that I mentioned that can help you in planning for sustainability. I want to thank you so much for getting this far in the process of thinking about scale and sustainability, and good luck with all of your sustainability efforts.